Hola, hola a todos y a todas, muy buenos días, gracias por acompañarnos. Eh, Hoy tenemos un programa súper interesante. Vamos a hablar acerca de las hierbas venenosas y con ello tenemos a Kobe Michael. Thanks, Kobe, for being here. Kobe is our guest today. He does speak English, so whomever speaks English can follow this naturally. And if not, you can see the translation and the transcription later on. Hi, Kobe. Welcome to CBD Max just today to this interview about what you wrote in your book about uh, poison, poisonous herbs, right?
Yeah. Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, I wrote about poisonous plants and how to work with them in all sorts of different ways.
Hi, Kobe. Well, could you please tell us a bit about who's Kobe? What does he does, and how did he got to write this book? Why?
Well, I am a lot of different things and constantly evolving in my personal life and my practice and my journey with the plants that I work with. I've always been interested in plants and herbs and had a connection to the natural world since a very young age. I grew up spending a lot of time in the garden at my grandparents' house. That was a very kind of wholesome and peaceful time for me. So, just a really positive memory that I have from childhood, working with the plants, harvesting the vegetables, collecting all of the seeds. So, before I really had a magical practice or an understanding of the more spiritual side of things. I just felt this intimate and heartfelt connection to the natural world and to plants specifically. As I got a little bit older and my interests in spirituality and esoteric studies started to develop, I began to become more aware of the consciousness and the energy and the magical potential that these plants have in ceremony and ritual. So really kind of made that my focus, and I initially focused on all sorts of plants. So it didn't start with poisonous plants, but herbs in general, researching their medicinal properties, their history, their folklore, and just found that to be a really fascinating topic. And it wasn't until probably 10 or so years into my esoteric studies that I began to become more aware about the use of plantas venenosas or powerful plants, plants with a very intense chemistry and what that meant as far as their potential for not only their medicinal uses, but also their applications in spiritual practice. So it's a relatively new, but also ancient sort of way of working with these plants that have this, very intense strength and power. And so it's still an unfolding journey. I'm still learning and discovering things, on a very regular basis, because these plants have so much to offer. So that's just a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Let's get right to the point about the book, which we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
So, how would you describe the poison path to someone hearing about it for the very first time?
Oh, the poison path. The longer that I walk this path, I feel like the more complicated the definition becomes. So at its core, it is an interest in poisonous and psychoactive and chemically active plants. So, this is a really big umbrella that encompasses a lot of different plants, herbs, and fungi that have a really wide variety of chemical actions and properties when it comes to how they affect us. So, part of that work is kind of understanding this concept of poison and how it gets applied to so many different diverse botanicals that it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. So if you're not exposed to this, initially you'll hear the word poison and you automatically think of, death and dangerous and something that doesn't have any kind of medicinal value, something that we should stay away from. So in a way, it teaches us to approach all plants on a very individual basis, looking at their historical uses, their medicinal properties, their importance in different traditional cultures and their practices, and really coming to a more individual understanding of how to approach our plant allies, both in medicine and in magic.
Okay, thank you. What was the earliest experience that sparked your fascination with banful and poisonous plants?
I've always been a little bit of a rebel. I've always been attracted to, maybe the darker side of things, or, when we're told not to do something, it makes me want to do it a little bit more. So I think that I just kind of had that natural personality trait that led me down this path initially. Um, my very first and I guess like most intense experience with a poisonous plant was with deadly nightshade or Atropa belladonna. So I'd
Hmm.
been growing it for a few years, researching it, and hearing all of these crazy things about the different effects that it had. Its use in the medieval witches' flying ointment, and I wanted to kind of find out for myself if it was capable of doing the things that people were saying that it was capable of doing. Giving hallucinations and causing delirium and making you hear voices and things like that. So it definitely does, and I found that out the hard way, and I also found out why, people don't consume these plants recreationally.
So many people misunderstand poisonous plants as purely dangerous. What is the biggest misconception you wish people would you let go of?
Um, just the general fear-based reaction. Poison is such a dramatic label. And like I said, it always makes us, first think of something as being just deadly and dangerous, where in the plant world, that's sometimes the case. But what we call poisonous plants, in medicinal herbalism are also referred to as low dose herbs. So they're plants that have a very potent chemistry and potent physiological effects on the organisms that consume them. So understanding that that potency has a purpose and can be applied in different ways to have different medicinal effects. So a lot of the plants associated with the poison path are also some of the most important sources of medicine, not just in herbalism, but also in more modern pharmaceutical medicine too, that a lot of these really important compounds are derived from plants that we would call poisonous.
Thank you. How do you personally differentiate between fear, respect, and reverence when working with these plants?
I think that fear, fear is a natural reaction. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. In a lot of cases, fear is kind of our survival mechanism that keeps us alive. But fear comes from a place of not understanding something, whether that's plants or animals or people or places. We have all of these fears and anxieties because of what we've been told and what we've been taught, and don't really have any, personal experience to base that on. And I think that once we begin to have those personal experiences, that is when the fear starts to transform into respect because there's more of an understanding. You're more grounded in your approach. You know how to work with a specific plant or connect with a specific spirit based on that, individual connection through your own learning.
Okay. Your book blends science, magic, folklore, and ritual. How do you balance these words without falling into extremes? Extremes.
Um, at this point, it's all kind of become like one and the same for me, which has been kind of an interesting part of the journey. I do like to take a more like practical and grounded approach, and especially when it comes to potent plants like these, having an understanding of the chemical constituents and the different effects that they have is really important so that we know, this plant is safe to put on your skin. This plant is not safe to eat. It helps you to avoid any really uncomfortable sort of situations. So the scientific understanding is really, really important. And what I've found is that a lot of our folklore and superstitions and taboos typically have some kind of a scientific explanation for them. So they all kind of feed together and are just like different aspects or different perspectives of, kind of the same thing.
Sorry, had mute. Which poisonous plant do you believe is the most misunderstood? What and why?
Um, Mm, that's a really good question. So, from my perspective, and just watching other people kind of in the community and hearing their feedback, it seems like one of the most popular plants for people to work with or to start working with is datura. And I think that that has to do, partly because of it growing in so many different places in the world. There's datura everywhere. It's easy to grow, it's easy to start. It's got these really, really beautiful, like trumpet shaped flowers that just kind of call out to people. So that seems to be one of the first poisonous plants that people begin to work with. But then it also happens to be one that has sort of the most like horror stories or almost like urban legends of people poisoning themselves because they ate a bunch of datura seeds and went crazy for 3 days and wound up having to go to the hospital. And so while that one seems to be the most attractive or accessible to a lot of people, it also seems to be one that kind of conjures up the most fear.
Of course. What are some of the subtle signatures of energies of banful plants that practitioners often miss?
um Well, I normally talk about the energetics of the plants in terms of their planetary correspondences, just because I feel like those categories have the most that we can kind of draw from when it comes to understanding energies that we're not familiar with yet. So we're using like existing symbolic we're using different symbol sets to build a new vocabulary about a plant, a spirit, an entity that we don't have like a existing understanding of yet. So when it comes to poisonous plants, they typically all fall under the rulership of Saturn. So in astrology, Saturn kind of gets connected to everything that is malefic or malevolent or dark or energies like death, destruction, chaos, um, different things like that. So that's kind of the general theme when it comes to poisonous plants across the board. But what I've noticed in working with them is that, yes, because they have that poisonous quality that would put them under the rulership of Saturn, but they also manifest a lot of other planetary energies as well. Um, and you could say this is probably the case with a lot of plants, poisonous or not. The three main energies that I wrote about in my first book, Herbolario de la Senda de los Venenos, are Saturn, Venus, and Mercury. So each one of those kind of represent a different point on the poison path and the different practices. So Saturn kind of representing more of the shadow work aspect, the underworld travel, the things that we more typically associate with baneful herbs. But then we also see these Venusian qualities in that, interestingly, outside of like modern use, the plants of the poison path, specifically the plants in the nightshade family, while they do have their medicinal uses, they've also been, very popularly used as aphrodisiacs in all different parts of the world. So they do have this more kind of seductive Venusian quality. And then the Mercury would represent kind of their more entheogenic side. So entheogen is basically a word that describes a substance that is psychoactive or psychedelic that's used in a religious context to create altered states of consciousness to connect with the spirit world. And that could be ancestors, general spirits of the dead. It could be deities. It could be connecting with the plant spirit itself. But these entheogens are always used within a ritual context. And for me, that spirit communication, that transmission of information is represented by the energy of Mercury, since Mercury rules language and communication and all of those different interactions.
Perfect. Could you
Mhm.
describe a moment when a plant taught you something that changed your understanding of its spirit nature?
Yeah, so whenever I talk about these things, all roads kind of lead back to deadly nightshade, since that's been sort of my main plant spirit ally, and one that I think has acted as an intermediary for me to communicate with and understand other poison plant allies. So, what initially attracted me to Deadly Nightshade is that it's got all of this really spooky folklore when it comes to the witch's flying ointment, and these practitioners that would apply these topical preparations or salves to their body to enter into trance states or to have dreams where they would actually travel in spirit to their spiritual gatherings and engage in all sorts of diabolical acts. So it's got all of this kind of um, interesting folklore when it comes to sort of the modern understanding of what witchcraft actually is and what witches were alleged to be doing in the Middle Ages. So that was sort of what initially drew me in. And then after a number of years of working with the plant and having that initial experience with the delirium and actually ingesting the plant and going through that sort of initiatory process, I started to find out more things on the scientific and medicinal end of the spectrum, which is just one of the examples of how they kind of connect and go together. That the tropane alkaloid atropine, which is derived, specifically from Atropa belladonna, has been used in the past to treat opiate overdose. It's also got a role in the history of um, Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, I don't know if that's international, like a recovery group for people struggling with addiction. So I
Yes.
started to find out all of these different ways that Deadly Nightshade in particular was connected to addiction and recovery and opiates specifically, which was something that I was dealing with at the time, and kind of in my recovery process. So it was pretty cool to find that out, that this plant that initially kind of attracted me with all these different bells and whistles happened to have, not only the scientific basis for treatment of addiction, substance abuse disorder, but then that translated into like the energetics and the sort of initiatory experience that I was going through, which eventually led me into um, detoxing off of the methadone treatment that I'd been on for about 8 years, and finally starting to like unpack some of the stuff that led to me having that dependency in the first place. So that was pretty mind blowing, that there was that deeper connection that I wasn't even aware of at first.
Nice. What distinguishes a plant that is merely toxic from one that is metaphysically powerful or initiatory?
What distinguishes a plant that is toxic from one that is initiatory, powerful? Um, well, there are there are different varying degrees of plant toxicity. So when I think of power plants or master plant spirits that have that initiatory capacity, and also share, that chemical potency, my mind kind of goes to plant medicine ceremonies. So that could be any kind of a plant with a potent chemistry that's capable of creating altered states of consciousness that invariably lead to some type of transformation or healing or ego death, or just kind of under the umbrella of initiatory experience in general. So there's certain ones that are poisonous in the sense that they create uncomfortable side effects. So for example, the plants in the nightshade family, they have the potential for causing harm, for possibly putting somebody in the hospital, but the recorded instances of lethality and the consumption of those plants actually leading to someone's death are really surprisingly pretty low. When we look to different indigenous cultures, especially throughout the Americas, we see particularly the daturas and brugmansia are incorporated into plant medicine ceremonies, sometimes in combination with other more familiar plant medicines like ayahuasca, or even taken by themselves to have these initiatory kind of effects and be part of like this larger ritual or ceremony. But within that category of toxic plants, there are other ones that are toxic more along like our initial definition of what that means. So things like poison hemlock or wolfsbane or hellebore or foxglove, plants whose chemical action is so potent and so unique that consuming them in any way would, put you in major physical danger. So metaphysically they all kind of fall under that same category and have that potential, but the ones sort of outside the nightshade family are a little bit more physically dangerous, so not ones that we ever see incorporated in any kind of like plant medicine ceremony or like ritual beverage or smoking blend, with a few exceptions, because foxglove in particular contains cardiac glycosides that are very important in heart medication for treating arrhythmias, cardiac arrest, edema related to cardiac arrest. But if a normal person were to consume those cardiac glycosides, it could potentially stop their heart. Same thing with wolfsbane or aconite. It's one of the most important medicinal plants in traditional Chinese medicine, But if it's not worked with properly and prepared in the correct way, it is, very, very deadly. One of the most poisonous plants in the world. And there's no antidote for being poisoned by aconite. It's just kind of like fingers crossed, hope you make it through. If you do, great. If not, sorry.
Really? So
Yeah.
that leads me to my next question. What are the most important safety lessons that newcomers overlook when approaching these plants?
So understanding that everyone is going to have their own individual reaction to different plants. Some people are extremely sensitive, so, could develop toxicity or, even like a rash or irritation by just like coming into contact with the plant material. So it's also always important to, wear gloves and also kind of gauge your own personal level of sensitivity. So for me, I can like handle fresh plant material all day long and I'm totally fine. Other people, handle fresh plant material, harvesting herbs out in the garden, and they realize that by the end of the day they're feeling a little loopy, and they fall into a really deep sleep or something. So kind of gauging those individual reactions initially, and then also remembering probably the most important thing, that as long as you don't eat them or put them inside yourself in another way, like, you're probably good. So all of the most dramatic stories and information that's out there come from like either accidental or intentional ingestion. So their effects are going to be much more dramatic, much more pronounced, if you're consuming them in some way versus, harvesting a few leaves. Or I keep looking over, I've got like some henbane that I just harvested before we got on the video, and I'm all like, no gloves, hands right in it, it's fine.
And what's that plant for? Could you explain a bit, especially in the plant that you just showed us?
Yeah, so henbane is a member of the nightshade family. So it's going to have similar chemistry to plants like datura, deadly nightshade, mandrake, all of which have a very extensive history, not only in their medicinal uses, but also in their folklore and their ritual uses. So henbane, believe originates in some part of Europe, maybe where like the East meets the West, and then it's kind of like branched out from there. So there's Egyptian henbane, black henbane, golden henbane, white henbane, and it contains these tropane alkaloids, which are alkaloids, active chemical constituents that affect our brain chemistry. They are known as anticholinergics. They're also used medicinally for the treatment of different gastrointestinal issues uh, because of their antispasmodic properties. Henbane is used in Ayurvedic medicine in particular. We typically see the seeds being used for different medicinal purposes. It was also at one point used in beer brewing. So they used to add henbane to the fermentation process because it increases the effects of alcohol. So it would take less beer for you to get drunk when it had henbane in it. And then they started to come out with laws that kind of regulated the different plants that beer makers could add to them, because there were all sorts of different plants that beer makers would add to their recipes to increase the intoxicating effects. And then they just said, no, you can't do that anymore. So now we just use hops.
Wow. How do practitioners know whether a plant is guiding them or whether it's their own projection?
Um, I think Just like with the scientific and the magical kind of connecting, like it's almost like a magnetic pole. So like maybe your own projections, whether those are fear-based, a specific aversion that you have to a plant, or like in my case, being like seduced by just the dangerous nature of the plant, kind of like your own projections, and then like the voice and the call of the plant kind of work in like an opposite but sort of a magnetic way that kind of pulls you in one way or another. um so for me it was just like this obsession and this fixation, and it's kind of hard to put into words. I've had passing interests throughout my life that have all been like extremely different, but for whatever reason, just the draw and the pull, it's like this undeniable kind of need to like connect and understand. And I find all plants to be interesting, but not every one of them calls out to me in the same way. And so kind of paying attention to those repetitive thoughts, those things that stand out to you that you just kind of become enamored with.
So, historically, banful herbs have been used in witchcraft, protection, and initiation. How do these traditions manifest in modern practice?
I think in similar ways, the modern practitioner, I feel like has a little bit, um, not a deeper understanding. I think because of our place in the modern world, and recent scientific discoveries when it's come to like energy and quantum physics, and just what we have discovered about the universe through science. It's kind of given us, I guess, more of a vocabulary to be able to express some of the more subtle qualities when it comes to working with plant consciousness or plant energetics. And that is a really big part of, working with plants from a spiritual capacity. So I think we're sort of doing the same thing, but we just have a different language to communicate that, which is important, especially when it comes to poisonous plants, because their chemical potency also tells us that there is a spiritual potency and an energetic potency. So it doesn't always mean that we are, consuming physical plant material or coming into contact with the physical plant on a regular basis, but that we have all of these other metaphysical tools that we can use to work with the energy of the plant and to connect with its spirit on a more subtle level.
But what responsibility does a modern practitioner have when sharing or teaching about poisonous plants?
Um, Responsibility. I think just not teaching from a place of fear, but a place of empowerment. Um, reminding people of the importance of common sense, that we are part of the natural world, and whether we live in a modern society or not doesn't change that, and we've survived here for quite a long time, sort of through common sense. So there's definitely a delicate balance. You don't want people to hurt themselves or put them in dangerous situations. Um, but there are some people out there that are just kind of, willingly reckless and behave in stupid and uninformed ways. However, on the other end of that, I think that there are some practitioners that have positioned themselves as voices on the poison path that have sort of played up the fear and, almost acted as gatekeepers and withheld information because they deemed it to be too dangerous for people to kind of make their own interpretations or go on their own journey. So it was almost like um, keeping that information puts people in more danger than being transparent and trying to educate people. So I think that that really, sharing as much as possible, and one person isn't necessarily better or more knowledgeable than another, and information that is kept hidden and kept secret doesn't really help anybody. It might help the one person keeping it for a little bit, but in the end, I think that that kind of circles back around and doesn't work out so well in the end.
Right. So you don't believe, or do you believe that some plants should remain secret or restricted?
um, I I think that we all find the plants that we're meant to when we are meant to. Um, like I said, some people are just reckless with their decisions and are going to do what they're going to do regardless of if they have an understanding of it or not. When it comes to restriction, I don't think that any plants should be illegal. I don't think that you can make plants illegal. I think like I mean, obviously, like there are legal restrictions and regulations all over the world. Even when it comes to things like cannabis and magic mushrooms and stuff that even modern medicine and science can't deny, like the healing potential and the benefits. But when I think you start to get into the area of saying, well, this plant is okay, but that plant is not, it just doesn't really resonate with me. Like plants can't be illegal, people can't be illegal, like we're all just here on the same planet, like doing our thing. And so no.
Right. Okay. In your opinion, is there a right or a wrong way to walk the poison path?
No, I wouldn't say that there's a right or a wrong way. And the poison path in particular is, inherently very individualistic. To call it even the poison path implies that it is, its own sort of specific tradition, which it's really not. It's more of a concept, and we can see, parallels to that concept all over the world. And the different ways that people work with poisonous or chemically potent plants, whether it's for spiritual purposes or medicinal purposes. So I think that it really looks different for everybody. And that's why it can be a little bit tricky for me even kind of talking about these things, because there's so many different angles and approaches and ways that people can benefit from working with these plants, that what interests me and what called out to me may not necessarily be what calls out to somebody else. And a lot of my work is kind of through the lens of um, an American-based practitioner working through the lens of like European witchcraft traditions. So that comes through just because that's my personal practice. But it's not to say that that is like the entirety of the poison path, because it's really like much, much, much bigger than that.
So, what has been the greatest challenge you've personally faced on this path?
The greatest challenge. So I talk a lot about my journey with addiction and recovery, because that's like a very big part of my personal experience and kind of who I am and why I am where I am today. But I wouldn't even say that that's been like my biggest struggle. Um, and I've been on that journey for such a long time that it's just kind of like second nature at this point. Um, but I guess something that I've maybe had like a little bit mm, more of a difficult time kind of wrapping my head around has been trying not to conflate my work on the poison path with other plant medicine practices that are rooted in indigenous culture. When I moved down to Florida from Indiana, I found myself in a part of the country where plant medicine tourism is very, very popular. And, you could like throw a stone and hit somebody that's doing an ayahuasca ceremony or a San Pedro ceremony, or you've got all of these, you know, hippie conscious kind of people doing like rape, and it's just very like it's starts to feel very like gimmicky and touristy for me. And I think that there are major benefits to that, but I just see sort of like the commercialization aspect of it. So for me, it was important to. Sorry, I'm thinking through my thoughts as I'm talking, which is why I'm not doing this in Spanish. When I moved down here, I almost felt the need to become part of that community and start doing all of these different plant medicine ceremonies, because it's like, oh, I'm talking about poisonous and psychoactive plants, but like I've never done ayahuasca, and started to feel like I somehow needed to prove myself, which was really like probably the last reason that you would want or should want to do ayahuasca. Um, so kind of distinguishing my own work and my own personal practice from these other plant medicine ceremonies that were happening around me, and kind of thinking, well, like how can I work with the plants that I've spent so much time with over the years, kind of in similar ways to keep my focus and keep my own trajectory, because I think that there are, so many potentials for the ceremonial use of, plants in the nightshade family, Amanita muscaria, magic mushrooms that can be sort of taken outside of that context, but at the same time, not creating restrictions or lines or barriers where there doesn't need to be any. So, kind of trying to hold space for both of those sides without letting them get too like mushed together. If that even makes sense.
Yes. Uh, if you could correct one myth about a poisonous plant forever, what would it be?
One myth. Mm, I don't think I would correct any of them. So when we start to work with poisonous plants, we have to approach them with the understanding that they, like us, come with a lot of baggage. Um, that's not always going to be positive things. Just like with humans, we don't want to necessarily like remember or share every bad memory, but they're still part of who we are. I think that a lot of our kind of understanding and different themes and things that get applied to these plants are sort of based on their interaction with humans. So, plants that are poisonous are not like venomous creatures. They're not using their poisons to hunt or as like offensive attack mechanisms. Plants can't move, plants can't walk around, so their poisonous effects are often the result of some kind of human interaction, their use and their misuse, and their stories kind of are as much reflection of us and the human component in that relationship as they are of the plant spirit. So I think that all of their myths and their stories, whether they're true or half true or good or bad, are an important part of kind of understanding the spirit or essence of that particular plant.
Of course. For someone feeling the call to this path, uh, but he's unsure or she's unsure uh, or afraid, what first step do you recommend?
Well, if you're feeling the call, there's a reason for it, and I think that you should follow that. If you're feeling fear or you're feeling apprehension, I think that that is totally normal. I think that we all experience that. Kind of sitting with, why do you feel that fear? Why do you feel that apprehension? Is it because of what you've been taught, or you're afraid that you're maybe going to hurt yourself or something like that? Um, it's kind of like coming to a deeper understanding of where that fear is actually coming from. Because a big part of working with these plants is kind of a collective shadow work that we are doing in unpacking some of the baggage when it comes to giving ourselves permission to work with these plants and to answer their call. So
Perfect. So, as we get to the end of this interview, which has been super, super nice, what would you hope your students, readers, and followers ultimately take away from your work with these plants?
um kind of my main focus and driving force is to give people inspiration and to put as much information out there as possible, whether that's through research or my own personal experience. So, I'm not trying to create like my own path or a specific way of doing things, but just to almost kind of like document my own journey and just provide people with examples and inspiration, and almost like, you know, just like I did, give yourself permission to find all of the different ways that we can connect with and work with these plants and all of the things that we can learn from them. Because I feel like we're really just kind of at the beginning in that point of the process. And if we allow ourselves, the room and give ourselves the permission to experiment and explore, then there's just an infinite number of possibilities as far as what we can learn.
Sorry, I was in mute. Thank you, Kobe. This was super interesting. I would like for you to please tell people where they can follow you and contact you in order, if that's okay, and tell us more where they can find your books and some more literature that you can share with them and follow you so they can ask you some questions, please.
Sure, sure. So you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Poisoner's Apothecary. You can also visit my website, thepoisonersapothecary.com, which is not only an online shop, but also an educational resource with lots of different articles that you can read for free. You can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/poisonersapothecary. And then I also host an annual plant spirit conference. It's called Botanica Obscura Conference every March. So we're getting ready for that. This year will be our 5th anniversary. We've got over 30 different presenters from around the world talking about a whole bunch of different topics related to plant-based spiritual practice, clinical herbalism, astrological herbalism, kind of you name it. And that'll
Mhm.
be happening in March, so definitely check that out.
Well, thank you
Mm.
and very, very much for your time. This was enlightening. And well, I hope many more people. I'm not suggesting you take them, I'm not suggesting you don't. Just understand plants and get some more info because it's important that we do inform ourselves before anything that we do, right? With
Yep,
conscience.
absolutely.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure, Kobe. I hope to see you again in CBD Mex. Thank you, everyone, which was present. We encourage you to share this to as many people
Mm.
as you can so many people can benefit from this knowledge. Thank you, Kobe. And
Thanks, Miguel.
thanks,
Nice to
everyone.
meet you.
Same to you. Nice to meet you. Have a great day.
You
Bye
too.
bye.